Richard, I think you're back. Can you start with that question again?
Yeah, sorry about that, guys. I heard the entire question, so I can answer. If that's okay?
Please go ahead.
I was saying that cities are critical to development and experience in emerging and developing nations. And a recent book by Professor Edward Glaser at Harvard surveyed intensively. And when he looks at the field, he finds that not only are the major cities and advanced economies centers of innovation and productivity, but in the developing and emerging world, urbanites, urban dwellers, even when faced with the biggest slum and settlement problems, refugee influx, migrant influx, even in those situations, the cities of those countries have higher living standards and higher wages than the surrounding communities. And I also mentioned that this past year we partnered with the Philips Corporation, and we created a global award for livable cities initiatives. And in that award, we collected projects and proposals from hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations worldwide. They were for livable cities initiatives that were replicable and consistent and pragmatic and would make their cities better and more productive places. The 3 awards we gave were all from cities in the developing and emerging world. So my sense is that improving city life, making cities stronger, as you're doing in the Youth Growth Strategy, dealing with the many problems of cities, is a key path on the road to real growth and real economic productivity enhancement.
Go ahead. Who's got the mic?
Thank you. It's not so much a question, but a confirmation of what Richard is saying. My name is Emil Wegelin. I work for the Cities Development Initiative in Asia, based in Manila, a co-production between the Asian Development Bank and the German government. I'm an urban economist, and I've worked in this terrain for the last 40 years, including in this country in my early years in the Kathiawardis in Karachi, in the Karachi Metropolitan Corporation. There is a recent book that's come out, and Richard, I'm sure, knows it, written by a Canadian journalist called Doug Sanders. And this book is called Arrival City. And it documents cases from all over the world testifying to the vibrancy of the informal areas in our cities. And in all the cities in the world, over time, these settlements have played a very, very important role in generating economic wealth, at the same time making sure that that willy-nilly happened in a way that was affordable for the people concerned. Typically, that book has stories about migrants that have come from the rural areas that have eked out an existence that was certainly better than what they had in the villages before. It's consolidated, and that was the way in which additional wealth was generated. I believe that over the past 40 years, that has been the dominant mode of generating wealth in our cities, and we should not forget that. I think that is a very important point. I'd like Richard to react to that, but it's also a point to make in response to my colleague from Malaysia. Thank you very much.
Sure. Richard, would you like to respond to that?
Thank you for that intervention. Doug is my colleague at the Globe and Mail and a terrific writer and reporter. I strongly recommend that book. I think you characterized it very aptly and very pragmatically, taking my ideas and making them very real. For public policy, I think there are 2 things that we can do. One, there are a lot of public policies that impede the process that you just mentioned of migration from rural to urban and resource mobilization. And second, we can engage public policies. We can put in place incentives and initiatives that enable that kind of resource mobilization. As Jane Jacobs really pointed out, what makes cities great is when you take a person with some aptitude and some ability, maybe not a lot of formal education, but a lot of ambition and energy, and you take them from an isolated community and you put them in, as you said, an affordable city around other ambitious and enterprising people who could come to work for them or provide a market for them, that can be ignited. And we've seen it time and time again. So from a public policy point of view, less of the top-down industry building, industry champions, much more of enabling this resource mobilization process that occurs from enabling talented and enterprising and ambitious people to make the moves they need to be, and hopefully in their own country. They don't have to jump over their own border to do it. In their own country, and use their talents and resources to build just these kinds of businesses, quasi-formal, quasi-informal. That seems to me, as you said, the key, not an afterthought, the key strategy for economic growth and mobilization in our new century.
Go ahead.
My name is Zubair Faisal Abbasi, and I work with UNIDO Pakistan. Thank you very much, Professor Richard Florida, for your very incisive comments on how the growth actually Pakistan in less developed countries, and particularly the role of innovation and the science and technology. My understanding is that if you look at the development experience of late industrializers like Japan or South Korea, or to a certain extent Hong Kong and others, and even if you look at the USA of 18th century and much earlier in the UK, all these countries which are now developed countries, they have been using the financial sector as a risk socializing, to socialize the risk involved in creativity and in innovations. A country like Pakistan, which has occasionally been under structural adjustment or stabilization, where finance is really a problem, and in some situations we crowd out the private sector. We do not use government investment as a crowding in for the private sector. We crowd out them. How in this scenario Pakistan's growth strategy can really build innovation without having financial resources to socialize the risk involved in that?
I think, Richard, that's a very good question, and it's a very key question in the minds of everybody. This country, we are still living in the old Haradoma or the two-gap model, where we think finance is primary to growth. And I think your creativity is kind of challenging that. So I think you should respond to that. Thank you.
Yes. First of all, it's an excellent question and very well phrased. Let me answer it by way of an example. I think you're absolutely right. In late developers, and the classic person I defer to on this is Alexander Gershon-Krohn, that you've either seen development of a very concentrated financial sector, or much more likely the state itself taking the reins of orienting the provision of finance for growth. I'm going to say something perhaps controversial, that is an old economy model. If you want to build a textile industry, and then an iron and steel industry, and then a car industry where massive amounts of new capital are required, that might have worked. I don't think it can work anymore. The illustration I'm going to give you from the context of the United States is the birth of the U.S. new economy in the Silicon Valley. No state provision of finance capital, no heavy arm of government involved in the venture capital. What happened was the entrepreneurs who built successful businesses mobilized the capital themselves. Some were able to touch a New York banker, not a big investment bank, a New York financer for a little flow of money. But the venture capital industry, the one that built the inventive companies, the Apple, the Intel, the Google, the Genentech, the ones that creative growth, grew up indigenously. So what I would encourage you is, going back to the previous questioner, enabling that process of migration and local resource mobilization to occur, and growing those entrepreneurs into something like venture financiers. Joseph Schumpeter said this a long time ago. He said, real entrepreneurship and real invention not only depend on great entrepreneurs, but new sources of finance, not the old banks and the old state structures, new sources of risk-taking financiers who, in my words, are often the first round of entrepreneurs themselves. So I would encourage the development of local indigenous venture financing mechanisms hinged to that environment, that can scour the environment for real talent, that can provide smaller scale capital. We know that economic growth and development come not from making one big bet. We know this is a mistake. They come from making hundreds and thousands of little bets And as those little bets begin to pan out, some rise and many fall. I would suggest that model of looking at the development of more innovative, growth-oriented industries might be a better model for your growth future than the past models.
I have a question here. Can you tell? Can I speak from here?
You're very clear. I hear you perfectly.
Okay. NDP. First of all, thanks for the excellent presentation, very thought-provoking. I wanted to ask you, cities are definitely platforms to energize creativity, but by the same logic and by the same dynamic forces, they can also create marginalization, inequality, poverty because of the exposure of different consumption habits, and you probably know much more than I do. So do you know any best practices or any suggestions that while transitioning from a rural society to an urban society where the center of growth and dynamism is cities, that as human beings who are banking on knowledge and accumulated knowledge and history, that we don't need to go through the same painful eras and experiences like the industrial era of the cities in Great Britain, for example. I would be very grateful if you could share any best practices that you know of. Thank you.
I think your question is very apt, and I think it's an area where you can invent them. I don't think any place, anywhere, has done very well at this. Even in my adopted home of Canada, where I am speaking with you from Toronto, which has done the best job that I can think of social inclusion, of diversity, of encouraging migrants from around the world, even with the best programs, we have rising inequality and rising political polarization, as one of the previous questioners mentioned. Rural